Good afternoon, my name is Ola Atamanova, and I want to thank everybody who joins us in Ukraine Media Center Ukraine Forum. Today is day 538 of the full-scale invasion of our homeland by Russian aggressor, and today the topic of our discussion is archaeological looting at public expense, how Russia is destroying Ukrainian cultural heritage since the beginning of the full-scale invasion. More than 500,000 of objects of our cultural heritage were damaged or destroyed as a result of Russian aggression. So today we will be talking about the scale of the existing losses. We know that more than 100 excavation sites were established in the temporarily occupied territories by Russians. So how do we seek the punishment for the Russians for crimes like those? I want to introduce our speakers today. Joining us are Evelina Kravchenko, archaeologist at the Institute of Archaeology of the National Academy of Sciences of Ukraine. Also joining us is Andrei Lusik, an expert on cultural heritage protection and regional Center of Human Rights. Also joining us is Darina Pedgorna, a lawyer with the Regional Center for Human Rights. Also joining us online is Natalia Hendel, researcher expert at the Foundation for Support of the Fundamental Research. So, Ms. Evelina, let's start with you. What is the scale? What are the consequences of Russian occupation with regard to our cultural heritage? What do we document for the time being? Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I would like to start with one case. Very frequently we hear about the combat necessity with references to the generals, Russian generals or non-Russian generals, the combat plans that don't take into account the existence of the cultural heritage objects in the territories which are being deoccupied where the combat operations are taking place. I would like to say that Dwight Eisenhower, the commander of Allied forces in the Mediterranean, a couple of weeks before disembarkment in Italy, issued an order number 68, Historical Heritage, that set forth the instructions to prevent the looting of historical buildings. This order emphasized the seriousness of crimes against cultural heritage and imposition of serious sanctions, including for the commanders. Before the operation in Normandy, the same Dwight Eisenhower, being already then the supreme commander of anti-Hitler alliance in Europe, on the 26th of May 1944, ordered the commanders to preserve the objects that are of cultural and historic value, preserve discipline and resilience. This is what was laid as the fundamental standards of NATO, and this is what is absent on the Russian side. What we're seeing on the Russian side, though, is the monuments. The monuments in the area of combat operations are being destroyed, being affected by combat operations and by preparatory actions, by setting up of the fire positions, of the defense positions, and so on. Crimea suffers a lot. In fact, the western and northern Crimea is completely dug by the Russians. No one pays attention to the historic monuments there. No one pays attention to the historic monuments that can be affected by artillery fire or air bombardments during any combat operations in Crimea. Those monuments are not being protected either by sand or otherwise. Another thing, the area of Kakhovka water reservoir, that land before the destruction of the dam did not exist, in fact. So this land is not in either administrative system of Ukraine or in the maps, so there are no monuments, no objects of cultural heritage in the registers of Ukraine, so it can all be looted. In the deoccupied territories, to a certain extent, almost all of the monuments are either destroyed or damaged by aviation or artillery fire. Digging of trenches affected the monuments significantly. I mean, those that are still in the soil. For the time being, we don't have destroyed objects of cultural heritage of global or regional meaning, but it just because they maybe haven't made it so far. In the south of Ukraine, we can observe the situation only during the occupation and afterwards. As to the monuments in the temporarily occupied territories, now the archaeological excavations are going on in Crimea under responsibility of Russian organizations. The Chersonesos Tavriya old city is being repositioned. There is the active propaganda campaign proclaiming the Khersones as the cradle of Russian Orthodox Christianity, and thus they propagate the distorted history of Russian Federation and the Christianity of the Eastern tradition. Khersones itself is being set up for the festival of ballet and opera right on the historic bricks. On top of that, I would like to mention that the farmers in the occupied territories, they destroy the kurgans using impunity. They use the bulldozers to destroy the kurgans. This is about the things, the immobile cultural heritage, the results of the excavation that are not existing in the legal field of Ukraine. However, they are added to the list of archaeological excavations. I mean, Crimea, something that was excavated by Russians since 2014 and all the way until now. Then the objects that were relocated from looted Ukrainian museums to Crimea, they exist in Ukrainian legal field, but they continue to be stolen to Russia on the premises of exhibitions, and they disappear from museum circulation, so they are being relocated to probably private collections from where they can proceed to illegal auctions, something that disappeared from Kherson, Zaporizhia and other district museums. Then the objects obtained by the private individuals, so-called black archaeologists, those objects are absent from the legal field of Ukraine, and they are almost likely to be sold at illegal auctions. So what we're stating is that the majority of what's going on in the occupied territories and Crimea, mostly in Crimea, are the processes where Ukraine jurisdiction doesn't work. So the Ukrainian law cannot work there even after the occupation. We have to engage international law, international organizations to influence the relocation of those objects. Ms. Evelina, do we understand at least the number of excavations that Russians set up and continue excavating? What do we understand about those historic and cultural values they pull from the ground? Well, we don't have extensive statistics. We will have it only as we get there, but talking about excavations, it's thousands of objects after Tavrida main way and so on. We understand the excavations in Chersonesos Tavriya, they exceed even the Tavrida main way by its scale, by number of cultural and historic objects. They were just pulling the things from the ground without any documenting, and we have no idea what was going on to those things. Those hundreds of thousands of cultural objects only in Khersones alone. Talking about Crimea in general, we're talking millions, so it's a colossal number of archaeological objects that were excavated by organizations. We don't have statistics about the cultural objects that were transported to Crimea. Maybe it's counted in hundreds of thousands. I'm sure that not all of them are relocated to Crimean museums. One way or another, they were disappearing in that direction, but certain amount of them has probably disappeared in private collections. We also don't have any statistics about the black archaeology in Crimea. I'm not sure any such statistics is being maintained. We will be only able to see that only if there is some internet site that where there is such a traffic, but for what I know, there is no such website. Mr. Dmitry, let's continue about the real destruction. What are the consequences? The consequences emerge in the context when the city construction stumbles upon the archaeological objects that exist in the landscape. I mean, the immobile monuments. The archaeological objects are the resource of the government, of the state. That's a scientific and cultural resource, and this is why they are being protected by the law, basically in all countries. And this law reflects in the municipal construction standards, and the archaeological monuments are part of those standards. And the situation with the historic monuments is like that. They've been worked with in two dimensions, as the landscape objects that are of cultural and aesthetic value, like for example kurgans or local settlements that were preserved, or where some structures were preserved, and other monuments that can be seen in the landscape and in the context of the cultural value that those monuments represent. So what's going on in Crimea now? After capturing Crimea, the Russian Federation has started an extensive construction campaign, economically unreasonable construction, because Crimea as a great territory, as occupied territory, will never be able to provide any economic output from those projects. We have thousands of kilometers of technical infrastructure being built across Crimea that will never justify itself. There is only a propaganda sense in doing that, when it's all represented in a way that, like, Russia is here forever. Let's look at the scale of construction we set up in Crimea. And from the other angle, it can be seen as a military infrastructure which allows Russians to wage the war in the territory of Ukraine, and it's all aided by Russian component, by the Russians. A bright example is the Tauride mainway. So the mainway is built within 1 year, and it was designed, and the civil hearings and all the previous phases of the design fit within 1 year, including archaeological inspections. I've seen some materials. It looks like a person with a bar in their hand were going along those construction site, taking selfies in front of the existing monuments. There was no serious examination. What are the potential cultural layers that can be destroyed during such construction, on top of the list of known monuments? And the construction itself was going with astronomical pace, and for the archaeological works, the archaeologists were engaged almost from all over Russia, because within one archaeological season they had to excavate the kilometers of archaeological layers. Many of those archaeologists never worked with monuments like those that they were studying during those excavations within construction of Tauride main way. And there are satellite images where we can see archaeologists work and everything is documented. We can see all of it, but on a distance of 100 meters away from them, the highway is being constructed. So there was no gradual examination before the construction works. It was not organized. It was almost impossible to organize it given the speed of construction works. And another important aspect is that apart from the monuments that were buried by those engineering communications, some of the monuments were dug that were not touched by the highway, like a hospitalny kurgan in Kerch. So the highway just passed it, but it was excavated to the ground to zero. And moreover, from hospitalny kurgan they made a paragon object. They invested a lot of money there. They made one and second examination. They published a book this thick. They were demonstrating it as a paragon monument that was playing in favor of Russian propaganda. Like, look, we're here, we study these territories, those are our historic monuments, but what's the crime from the angle of view of Ukraine? The crime is that the Ukrainian scientists cannot obtain the materials of those studies. They cannot perform any studies there themselves. The only information they're getting is second-hand, something that Russian scientists have written about those monuments. And any scientists that study those regions, those periods, they are now forced to rely on their work, and there is no way for them to reanalyze this work and draw their conclusions without basic material, the material from the archaeological excavations. And it's all demonstrated as Russian activity, including abroad as Enlightenment activities. They are very influential in the Western world in this context, but it's our cultural heritage, our cultural memory, and by works like that they deprive Ukraine of historic memory and title to historic memory and culture. And this is the main crime in this context. And both economic activity, construction, archaeological activity are all components of colonial policy and propaganda. Thank you, Mr. Andriy. Ms. Natalia, are you with us? If you're with us, please join our conversation. I would like to ask you about the international practice for protection of cultural heritage, what it is, and organizations like UNESCO. Are they efficient? Can they really help us in preservation of our cultural heritage? Thank you for your question. Really, international, both government and non-government organizations have an important meaning in terms of support of Ukraine, but there are many questions arising regarding their efficiency. To what extent is this support efficient and timely in response to this threat, to this situation taking place in Ukraine? To answer this question, we were talking about UNESCO, for example. And to focus our attention on the role of UNESCO, we have to focus on what UNESCO can do pursuant to their mandate and how efficient is the activity that is contemplated by the statutory documents. I mean, the statute of UNESCO which is also called Constitution of UNESCO, because if we review this statute, this Constitution of UNESCO, we see that the term war is only met there 4 times and only in preamble. So when this organization was created right after World War II, international community was seeing the world as a peaceful place. They've never seen the necessity for those specialized UN institutions to act within armed conflict situation that we have now. But if we look at the convention that was adopted by UNESCO, the Convention of year 1972 on preservation of natural, historic and cultural heritage, the term war is only added in Article 11 there, and authorizes UNESCO to act in order to protect that global historic and cultural heritage. First, to create the list of that heritage which is under threat, and such threat is represented by the armed conflict and with the government of the country which is a participant of this convention, and in case necessary to create a fund to renew that cultural heritage. So that's the first thing. This is the legal fundamentals, something we should pay attention to, and something that should be taken into account when we talk about UNESCO or any other government and non-government organization. They will be always limited with their statute. And the experience of UNESCO in renovation of cultural values during the conflict, it exists because unfortunately the humanity was facing armed conflict after the year 1945, and the cultural values had to be preserved and protected by this organization and other actors that are involved in preservation of cultural and historic values. So such experience exists in Syria, in Sudan, Cambodia, but talking about its efficiency, if we analyze the time frame, all those actions are being delayed by bureaucratic procedures, by diplomatic activity, because it should be coordinated with the parties to the conflict, it should be coordinated with the governments of the countries, and those bureaucratic and diplomatic activities, such response falls behind the existing demand. Also, we have to take into account this experience that was developed within UNESCO practices to understand those limits, both time limits, diplomatic and bureaucratic limits that may pose a challenge for Ukraine in their cooperation with UNESCO to preserve and protect the cultural and historic heritage. Also, when we talk about UNESCO and regarding Ukraine, what is positive and what should be actualized? First of all, starting from the year 2014, UNESCO supports the position of territorial integrity of Ukraine. This is the position that has legal, diplomatic, and political meaning. And secondly, starting with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, there were plans for renewal developed in coordination with UNESCO. And this renewal concerns both scientific and educational and cultural space, because we understand that the goal of this organization's activity is those areas. So also, if we talk about UNESCO, we talk about mostly peaceful life. However, there is this Article 11 of the convention dated 1972. However, the special regime that operates to protect the cultural heritage and which Ukraine should be using now are the standards of international humanitarian law that protect the cultural values, both general standards and contemplated by the Hague Convention and Additional Protocol 1908 and the Hague Convention 1954 and two additional protocols, because it invokes questions to Ukraine too, because Ukraine doesn't use the regime of increased protection of his cultural values. So if we talk about the international practice, international diplomacy, international cooperation, international law, it's important to use the mechanisms available to Ukraine, including the mechanisms contemplated by UNESCO and mechanisms contemplated by the international humanitarian law. Second, what can UNESCO be useful with? Apart from Ukraine, it includes another 193 members, and using this platform, we can involve in renovation, restoration of cultural values and return of cultural values that were damaged or destroyed as a result of armed conflict. So we may engage other member countries in those processes whose cultural heritage is also existing in Ukraine. So again, that's cultural diplomacy within this organization. And the last thing I want to draw everyone's attention to, that within UNESCO there is an intergovernmental committee for return of the cultural values. It exercises its activity on return of the cultural values that were stolen during armed conflicts, and this mechanism should be used actively too. We should document all the cultural values that were looted, that disappeared, to use that mechanism further on to return them. And to wrap it up, no one has ever cancelled the mechanism of sanctions that the governments can use against so-called black archaeologists with regard to the looted cultural values, to ensure their further return to the state where they used to belong. Ms. Natalia, right away I'm having a question to you. To what extent is Ukraine using all those available mechanisms that you've just mentioned, and where we should reinforce our efforts? Thank you for your question. In fact, Ukraine does a lot. If we take an international mechanisms for advocacy, the activity of Ukraine is very intense, but there is always something that can be done on top of that, some more steps that should be made. Again, I'm talking about the use of the special regime contemplated by the Hague Convention 1954. This work should be done by the Ministry of Culture, for example. Also, the regime of the increased protection to perform the diplomatic work with the governments of other partner countries on the imposition of sanctions for trade of Ukrainian cultural values. But they should be first identified. We should have the registers. We should identify every single item. So there is a very extensive work to be done. Is it enough? For the time being, I think not so much. Was there a timely evacuation of Ukrainian cultural values? I think that the answer would be negative. So there is still a lot of work to be done to protect cultural values, even within those two conventions, the international agreements, the Convention of UNESCO dated 1972, the Hague Convention 1954, and second protocol dated 1999 to increase the protection of cultural values. Thank you very much, Ms. Natalia, Ms. Darina. I will have a question to you. We've discussed the international practices and mechanisms. So if we talk about our national practice, what are they? To what extent are they efficient? And what's the role allocated for our executive power, police, prosecutor's office, and are their efforts enough? Let's start from the beginning. The war goes on in Ukraine since 2014, and when the conflict has started, it was clear that we were all shocked that something like that is possible in the century 21, and our legislation was unfortunately not ready to respond to such events unfolding in Ukraine. Talking about the conflict, the humanitarian problems, the value of human life, their health is obviously prioritized. It cannot be denied, it cannot be forgotten. However, behind the human lives, there is a lot of other matters like energy, life, identity of those people, their education, culture, information policy. For me, for example, they should be equalized with the human lives because people cannot exist in vacuum. People rely on their identity, their history, their culture. This is how the people form themselves. And just like Mr. Andrei and Miss Evelina were saying what Russians are doing to our culture, which is a part of the global history in Crimea, in Donbass, and right now during the full-scale invasion, they destroy Ukraine, they destroy Ukrainian nation, they destroy Ukrainian individuals as such. So Russia currently cuts the air for us, ensuring vacuum. Unfortunately, they're doing it very well, specifically in the area of information policy regarding the cultural activity in Ukraine. The legislation is still not prepared. Still, we cannot say that it's efficient for prevention of those occurrences. We ratified the conventions that Ms. Natalia mentioned, for example, the convention dated 1954 and the Framework Convention of the Council of Europe about the criminal persecution for cultural issues. Both conventions contain an extensive number of standards which are capable of preventing the crimes in cultural life of Ukraine and to some extent protect what was left, at least in the occupied territories and in non-occupied territories as well, obviously. So talking about the convention dated 1954, there is an article about the prohibition of archaeological excavations in the occupied territories by the occupiers. Unfortunately, our Ukrainian lawyers in the national system don't really like reading texts in English, don't really like to appeal to the international agreements. They see it as something extra complicated. They should be aided in implementing it in the national law. So such processes are going on now in the committees of the Ministry of Justice, Ministry of Culture. There are programs for ratification and implementation of those conventions in the national legislation, but now with the beginning of the full-scale invasion, those processes are delayed and I think postponed. And the same story is with Nicosia Convention, the Convention of the Council of Europe, which contemplates the direct obligation by the government as to protection of the cultural heritage in the conditions of the armed conflict. So now we are in a situation when our criminal code of Ukraine contains only 3 to 4 articles which to some extent may protect the culture. The article 438, laws and customs of war, that we can conditionally add the UNESCO Convention and Hague Convention to but we have to understand that that article is mostly about the peaceful life, but the conditions we live in now, they force us to use it otherwise. And in the same way, the prosecutor's office of the Autonomous Republic of Crimea is using it now. They have a couple of cases about illegal archaeological excavations in Crimea. They investigate those cases starting from the years 2014 2016. This is when those cases were filed. Talking about the policy of the state generally, unfortunately, I cannot say that it's perfect in terms of preservation of cultural heritage in the conditions of armed conflict. We have advocacy policy regarding the culture. Our artists are present in all the platforms all around the world. We continue traveling and telling everybody about our culture, but that's one side of the cultural diplomacy. But there is another political and legal side, and it's more valuable for protection of cultural heritage. And in this area, I wouldn't say that we are on the first place in this platform. The Russians, with their allies, they overtake us in this platform. The Secretariat of UNESCO is made up of Russians or Russian sympathizers, and during personal conversations with the representatives of UNESCO and national committees of UNESCO and the Committee of the Blue Shield, which covers the museum affairs all over the world, they say that unfortunately we cannot do anything because Ukraine doesn't claim the needs to protect the cultural values. So there is a list of destroyed cultural values in the website of UNESCO, but it dates year 2022. In the same way, in this website of the Ministry of Culture, there is such list available, but it dates year 2022, and it seems like the state just neglects the previous 8 years of conflict, as if they've lost this cultural policy, this education policy. Now we have zombified population there, zombified children who don't know what was going on in Crimea. They only think that it was a cradle of Russian Orthodox Christianity. So unfortunately, we've lost this war in part. However, we can prevent it in future if right now we start acting. And I'm not only talking about expediting of ratification of international agreements, of implementation of this practice in our real life, not only about investigating those cases that are on the desk of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine. It should be a consolidated, consistent policy and the level of the strategy of national security of Ukraine. By the way, on the website of the parliament, there is a small draft law called the Law on Amendments to the Strategy of National Security of Ukraine, which contemplates the amendment by the small sentence that national identity and culture of Ukraine are one of the components of the security of Ukraine, security of the region. So if it starts working now, I think that the policy of the government would change and we wouldn't have all those scandals with Ministry of Culture and their activities. We wouldn't ask why do we need that culture. We wouldn't have any questions regarding reintegration of the temporarily occupied territories to bring in normal understanding of history back to the people in those regions. We wouldn't have those questions that probably the absence of cultural policy in Ukraine could provoke another conflict in future, because as we take back Crimea with the military way, people hardly would be happy there. Most likely it will be within the framework of battle operations, and people would not be happy with Ukrainian cultural policies in their regard. They will hardly be happy about preservation of the cultural values remaining in Crimea. They will hardly be happy about the fact that we will relocate a lot of cultural items to Kiev, for example, for restoration. But if we establish this vision now, we may prevent such negative events unfolding in future. But we should be doing it now. But now the government tends to do something serious. Yes, I agree. Kakhovka Dam, counteroffense, they are very important. You know, this night air raid on Ukraine, that's a horrible tragedy. But those are the things that are being solved within a moment. But we should have a strategic vision for the future. But for the time being, unfortunately, I haven't seen this strategic vision by the government for decades, for centuries ahead. We have a vision for 5 or 7 years, but something is about to happen after 7 years. But unfortunately, there are no movements in that direction. But as a civil sector, we support initiation of such processes. Darina, thank you very much. We're all preparing to enter Crimea to bring this temporarily occupied territory back. We have projects for integration of Crimea being developed. Do those programs contain this issue with archaeological investigations? What should we do in Crimea with those who were excavating, with the condition of those cultural values? Something maybe completely excavated, something semi-excavated. So how should the state of Ukraine act? What should we do with this situation there? And as we come back to Crimea, yes, you're right. Now there are certain working groups that are developing reintegration policies for Crimea specifically. However, we have to understand that that plan of actions that was formulated previously, it's obsolete for current realities. That plan of actions contemplates the peaceful settlement of the occupation of Crimea by diplomatic negotiations. It has not changed. So there are questions to the quality of those reintegration strategies being formulated now, because they should legally rely on the general strategy which talks about the peaceful ways. So they cannot say that when we enter Crimea, most likely some part of the structures in Crimea would be destroyed, and thus the quality of such strategies is not 100%, and I hope it's about to lose the value that we need critically now. There are certain groups within the Crimean platform, and there is a group for humanitarian policy. They develop the strategies that contemplate certain mechanisms. But the first thing we should do it now. Those are the amendments to the national law that envisage very strict protection of the national heritage, the prohibition of archaeological excavations, the prohibition of metal detectors and stuff like that. With legislation like that, we can easily enter Crimea, and the processes will be taking place there. They will be delayed in time. They will be difficult. We should understand there will be purges, there will be persecutions, and Russians will be fleeing, and we will have Russian archaeologists and Ukrainian archaeologists who have become collaborationists. The policy against collaborationists is not yet formulated, but it exists in practice. There are also negative sides, that we don't have enough human resources to replace those whom we are about to conditionally say engaged there. We don't have qualified archaeologists, we don't have a lot of students interested in those areas of culture, and the state of Ukraine should be currently working in that area too. Talking about the work of Ministry of Education, Ministry of Culture, who should stimulate the youth to study, at least in Ukraine, to obtain that profession. On the website of the representative office, we have this questionnaire for the youth, so that after the occupation, they moved to Crimea to take some administrative offices, but it doesn't take into account the cultural sector, which has a little bit different nature. Mr. Andrei, Miss Evelina, Miss Natalia, so the same question, what should the state do with all that was happening there? Well, generally, Darina outlined everything very correctly. I don't want to repeat her again. I just want to emphasize one thing. Let's get back to the practice. In theory, you know, we have everything in theory. In theory, everything is correct, but talking about practice, we have two clear needs right now. First, it's the specialist who can clearly document the crimes against the cultural heritage. It should be the responsibility of Ministry of Culture directly. Those people can get certificates, they can get on the registers. It's not so important, but they are supposed to be able to document the violation, any scratch, and any destruction of the monument, or otherwise document the fact of disappearance of an item from museum exhibits. The more people like that we have, the better, because by training specialists like that, we would be able to create the legislative narrative as well. So there would be a database that formulates the needs to be identified on the legal level. Secondly, now we are already facing such a problem. In the Hague Convention strictly sets forth that the historic and archaeological monuments, in case of their use by the military, in case of presence by the military, they should be segregated as those that cannot be used, those that have no significant meaning, and those that can be used by the military. So we don't have such scale in our legislation. There are tens of thousands of archaeological, historical spots, architectural spots. What should be segregated as something that cannot even be approached, or where the use of the military force may be used to a limited extent? So who is going to sign this document, and aren't they going to be litigated further on, because there is no such thing existing in Ukrainian legislation? This is something that is supposed to be done now, right now. Mr. Andrei, do you have anything to add? Well, on top of what was said, on top of the fact that the cultural heritage should be a component of national security strategy that would expedite all the processes objectively, I have to say also about the control and a little bit about investigations. Apart from having prosecutor's office in Crimea, who investigates the archaeological crimes committed by Russia, after we deoccupy Crimea, on top of our problems with cultural heritage, we will have Crimean problems added to them. And what's important there is that the main problem is the problem of control of this activity, because the controlling bodies in area of the cultural values, they are disseminated across the local, regional, and municipal administrations, and they are very dependent on their capabilities and political will of the local administrations. And in fact, the control over the work without permits, for example, or the municipal construction in those areas where the standards and rules that protect the archaeological monuments are in collision with the economic activities, so such standards are absent. We have to create a very strong state control authority that would not depend on the capability of the local government and local policies. An authority that would deal with those problems, that would have an inspection capable of putting together the protocol of violation, that can catch those black archaeologists, document what they were doing, deprive them of their tools, deliver them to their policy, and to hand over the protocols to the investigation officer, who would hand them over to the prosecutor. Because we have the problem with the institutional capability of the control authorities to deal with the protection of the historic monuments. They don't have such specialization right now. Why I'm talking about control? Because it's the key problem. We can examine the monuments, we can research them, we can study them, but no country can find a number of archaeologists capable of studying all the monuments in their country without their destruction. And it shouldn't be done, because it works in a different way. Any country which is concerned about their cultural heritage should have a normal control exercised over this activity. Thank you very much, dear friends. Do we have any questions from the floor? Well, I'm not seeing any on the floor, but we have a question online. How can Ukraine force Russia to be brought to liability? Is there a way to force Russia to compensate for such losses, and is it basically real? Well, we won't be able to punish Russia collectively, but we may punish some specific people, and those people, their names are known to everybody basically. It's the Minister of Culture of Russian Federation, the Minister of Culture of the Republic of Crimea, and other so-called republics of Russian Federation, the director of the Museum State Hermitage, Mikhail Petrovsky, and those archaeologists excavating now in Ukraine, Rukavishnikova, Solovyov, Vyukov, and so on and so forth. A part of those archaeologists, their names are being covered by the national sanction lists. Solovyov and Vnukov are regular customers there, so to say. Some countries listed them as well, but those countries are not so numerous. They still have access to international platforms. They proclaim themselves as the best experts in the area of archaeology. They boast their Crimean expeditions in the scientific platforms, but they can be brought to liability. In fact, to do that, their activities should be documented and explained from the point of view of international law, why such actions constitute violations. Those materials should be handed over to the security agencies, law enforcement agencies. I'm talking about the Security Service of Ukraine, police, prosecutor's office, and so on and so forth. And there they will be brought to liability according to the national law, and they will be brought to liability under this scenario. This is scenario 1. And the second scenario is when we can condemn the top-level government officials, not only in national but international level. To do that, we also need to document and explain them why their actions are intentional, why they are illegal. And such materials should be handed over to such institutions as Interpol and Europol, who are entitled to persecute the perpetrators all across the world, and Europe, the Council of Europe, who will impose political and economic sanctions against them. It should be the United Nations organization who can condemn such activities in their resolutions to formulate certain narrative among them. member states of the United Nations. And we also may file a case in the International Criminal Court, given the provision of relevant evidences. For example, Regional Organization for Human Rights were formulated such a case, and we filed it to be considered by a prosecutor of International Criminal Court. It was accepted, and the policy of International Criminal Court regarding the cultural heritage, given the Ukrainian context, was issued that very same year. And I hope that eventually that award that we are about to get in the future from the International Criminal Court, it will contain the issues of national identity, cultural heritage, and we will be able to bring to liability not only Putin and Maria Lvova Belova for their crimes related to deportation of Ukrainian children, but also for their crimes against national identity of Ukrainians. Do I understand it correct that we can talk about the compensation of losses only given the second scenario? No, if a national judge of Ukraine will say that apart from sentencing the perpetrators to certain terms, they will also be penalized to pay compensation to the owner of this or that facility or object. On the other hand, we have International Criminal Court, which is capable, well, the issue of compensation to be awarded by International Criminal Court, it's another sphere because they deal mostly with humanitarian issues, but we may talk about compensation from some charity funds that are currently created and they accumulate resource for compensation. We can talk about compensation related to the future agreement about the capitulation of Russian Federation and victory of Ukraine, which strictly sets forth that such resources, such funds should be reimbursed to Ukraine by Russia for their crimes committed against cultural values. It may be the return of the looted values, it may be the return of cultural and historic archive that they steal, it may be the reconstruction of those museums and monuments that Russian Federation has destroyed during their combat operations in Ukraine. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for this conversation. Incredibly important. I hope that really we are being listened to by the government authorities who would use all those advice that you have provided to them today. They are really very useful, and I think that the topic of our cultural heritage will be clear to all of us. It be perceived as a very important topic. I also want to traditionally thank our armed forces for having opportunity to hold events like this. Let's work together for our victory, and glory to Ukraine, glory to the heroes.